And let me say this. Hey, everybody. This is Wonderland Book Club featuring Dr. Jason Miller with Langston Hughes, A Critical Lives book. And this is Jason Miller.
What an honor and delight to be with you here. I'm getting a little bit of an echo and it just disappeared wonderfully. Alice, I am so thrilled. It's not often you get that wonderful an introduction, and that was meticulous and detailed, and gives me chills always to be back with you. I remember at least one of you from the last go-round. Paget, I think you were with us when we talked about the lynching book. Is there anyone else out there that was here the last time I was with us? I have a pretty good memory then. If I got one out of everybody, we got them right. So that means the next time we meet, I'll remember you, okay? So the next book go around, I'll remember you for being here today. Alice's work was sensational. She documented what happened at the Chickasaw River to Ernest Green and Charlie Lang, and it's not been long forgotten on my memory. Today, what we're here to do is to introduce you to the life and times of Langston Hughes. Because I am familiar with this wonderful group, I'll talk a lot about the process involved as well for writing the book and publishing, and am, of course, open to all your questions and insights as we go along, and certainly by the time we get finished, I hope we have a wonderful discussion about numerous things that come up. The first thing I do want to say about this book is it was really quite different. I was reflecting on it this morning, and I remembered that it was the first biography on Langston Hughes' life to be published in over 35 years. We had not had an updated biography of the great poet Langston Hughes since, are you ready for it? 1986. So it's been that long since we'd really revisited this subject, and so much has been learned. You're going to learn two huge things today. Let's just get to the first one right away. You are among the very first people to realize that Langston Hughes was actually born in 1901. You're not going to believe this, but for the first 25 years of my life, I always taught and believed that Langston Hughes was born in 1902. Just within the last 10 months, we realized that we had his birth year wrong. This site, newspapers.com, produced this incredible research out of Topeka, Kansas, where a number of scholars were sitting in their bedroom late at night, tracking through the newspapers, and realized that because Langston Hughes' mother was fairly famous, goings-on in her house were recorded in the local newspaper. And there was a story about little Langston Hughes hurting his arm a full year before we knew him to be born. So you will not forget that Langston Hughes lived from 1901, and then the harder part, died in 1967. Most of us think of Langston Hughes in the 20s and 30s. We do forget that he lived and was alive all throughout Martin Luther King's life. In fact, he only died less than 11 months before Dr. King's assassination. He was active, publishing, writing, and doing things with a really unique musician that I'll preview the next project I'm working on a little bit today. So you get a sneak preview of those things as well. And Langston Hughes was vibrant, active, and publishing at the time. I'm going to share my screen, play a little bit of audio video, show you some images, and talk through things. The very first thing that I want you to do is I want you to hear Langston Hughes in his own voice at probably the place where most of us are familiar with him. Langston Hughes presenting this idea of blues music and creating the genre of blues poetry. So this is Langston Hughes in his 1925 award-winning poem, The Weary Blues. And I'd like you to hear it before I settle in and give you a little bit more background and context on the thing we always think we know about Langston Hughes, his engagement with blues music. This is the voice of Langston Hughes reading his 1925 Opportunity Award-winning poem, The Weary Blues.
Droning a drowsy, syncopated tune, rocking back and forth to a mellow croon, I heard a Negro play. Down on Alex Avenue the other night, by the pale, dull pallor of an old gas light, he did a lazy sway. He did a lazy sway to the tune of those weary blues. With his ebony hands on each ivory key, he made that poor piano moan with melody. Oh, blues. Swaying to and fro on his rickety stool, he played that sad, raggy tune like a musical fool. sweet blues, coming from a black man's soul. Oh, blues. In a deep song voice with a melancholy tone, I heard that Negro sing, that old piano moan. Ain't got nobody in all this world, ain't got nobody but myself. I was going to quit my frowning and put my troubles on the shelf. Thump, thump, thump went his foot on the floor. He played a few chords, then he sang some more. I got the weary blues and I can't be satisfied. Got the weary blues and can't be satisfied. I ain't happy no more, and I wish that I had died. Far into the night he crooned that tune. The stars went out and so did the moon. The singer stopped playing and went to bed while the weary blues echoed through his head. He slept like a rock or a man that's dead.
Now let's say a few things about this particular poem. Langston Hughes started writing it in about 1922, and he didn't publish the poem for another 3 years. There were two reasons for this. Number one, he realized it was really, really good. And so he didn't want to just throw it out there in any old publication. He wanted to wait for the right moment. The second reason he didn't publish it right away is because he couldn't find an ending for the poem. He didn't know how to come to a conclusion at the end of those lines. In fact, Langston Hughes thought this poem was so exciting and unique that he didn't share it with a close friend of his named County Cullen, a fellow poet, well-known and well-regarded, who he had been exchanging works with back and forth in the revision process. Hughes hid it from him. When he finally submitted the poem, he submitted it to a contest for Opportunity magazine. And in 1925, there was the largest gathering of Black intellectuals in the history of the 20th century in New York City. They were all there for the leading magazine to announce its award winners. The premier award was for first place in poetry. Langston Hughes drug himself from Washington, D.C. to New York, literally suffering from malaria, borrowing a suit coat as well as train fare to show up, and he was announced the winner out of a group of about 790 applicants, first place in poetry. His award was read by James Weldon Johnson, the writer of Lift Every Voice and Sing. The very next day, a newspaper in New York said, there is something afoot here. We might call it a Negro Renaissance. What you know as the heart of the term Harlem Renaissance was born the day after Langston Hughes won this award for this poem. It has originally been called the Negro Renaissance, then it became known as the Harlem Renaissance. Scholars in my field today are referring back to a book by Elaine Locke and starting to talk about it now as the new Negro movement, talking about the political desires of a group, not just their artistic accomplishments. But the term Harlem Renaissance is inextricably linked to the success of Langston Hughes and this particular poem. Now, what's very fascinating about this book project is it was very different than the two earlier works I had done. The first book that I wrote from start to end literally covered the span of 11 years. That does not mean that I worked on it every day and did nothing else, but from the start of the research to it actually appearing in print was 11 years. The second book was 8 years. This book was very different because it was a summation of a lot of the research I had done, and it had to fit in really unusual parameters. This company from England does this series called Critical Lives, and the publisher takes any entity throughout the world that is an important figure. So these can be artists in the field of painting, these can be philosophers, these can be great musicians. And in this series, they pick only the top intellectuals in the world. And so they contacted me and asked me if I would write this book in this particular parameter of limited number of words, limited number of pages. But they had one really important feature. They said it had to have 35 photographs. I said, that's not a problem. I would love to have 35 photographs in a book. And they said, of course, we will pay for the cover image. You can imagine that when I submitted the cover image, I wanted something of Langston Hughes from either the 50s or 60s. But lo and behold, when it comes to publication and rights, people always want to see Langston Hughes in the 20s or 30s. So this is the image we got of the image we expect from Langston Hughes in this regard. One of the more fascinating things with this project is because the distributor distributes the book worldwide, primarily through India as well, that it had to be in British punctuation and spelling style. So one of the more challenging aspects was realizing that color needed to have a U in it. Realizing that instead of using double quotation marks, there had to be single quotation marks. And realizing that all the dates needed to read day, month, then year in this British style. It was quite challenging. It was a whole separate set of passes throughout the book. What was fascinating, briefly, and then I'll move on, is that I found that in many ways the British style makes a lot more sense than what we do in America. The single quotation marks avoided redundancy. I was quite surprised at how efficient it was to have the dates the other way to avoid kind of confusion. And it was a unique process in that particular regard. But it has been kind of unique thinking about it in those ways and how things take place. So this is the book, and this is the cover. And I had two challenges. Number one, tell everything about Langston Hughes's life that the average reader needed to know. And secondly, take his most important works and put them in the context of what was going on historically and also biographically in his life. So you've been kind enough to join me today and invite me into your living rooms. I should have brought a bottle of wine for such wonderful invitations into your homes. Before you started this session, you knew Langston Hughes was pretty cool, but you had no idea that he was this cool. You're looking at an image of Langston Hughes selling Smirnoff vodka in Ebony magazine in 1959. Now, many of you will remember the dates of the 50s and 60s and those who were famous for selling products. Ernie Banks, Frank Sinatra, other key figures. But you'll be right in saying, I didn't remember any other poets famous enough that they were selling and distributing products in a major magazine. Ebony magazine was one of those giant magazines. You remember the size of Life magazine, how big it was, oversized? Ebony magazine was like this for an African-American audience. There's really fascinating research on this that I did not conduct, but have understood over the previous years. Magazines like this that came out once a year had subscriptions of about 760,000, but scholars in that field are realizing that that in no way accounts for how many people read the magazines because of them appearing in doctor's office, dentist's office, and beauty parlors. If you think of a magazine coming out once a month and sitting there for 30 days, it's hard to estimate how many people would flip through that per day and see these particular images. Often the interest is kind of doubled, if not tripled, for kind of marketability. Why was Langston Hughes selling Smirnoff vodka in Ebony magazine in 1959? Because a play had just hit Broadway based upon his most popular poem, in which he began that poem by talking about what happens to a dream deferred. Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? And so only weeks before this advertisement, Lorraine Hansberry's runaway hit, A Raisin in the Sun, starring Sidney Poitier and Ruby Dee, had opened to runaway success on Broadway. March 11th, 1959 is when it debuted. And within weeks, it had done the unheard of thing, which it has secured a contract to be turned into a motion picture without having its black cast members changed or altered. Columbia Pictures went through that, and so that became a remarkable point. Why is he showing us this image? To say this: Langston Hughes was never more popular than he was in 1960. Now again, think of where we start in Langston Hughes. We think of the 20s and the blues scene. We think of maybe even the 1930s. but Langston Hughes' popularity actually peaked in 1960. The only anthology at the time, called the Anthology of Negro Poetry, included all the best Black poets in America. Langston Hughes was given approximately 13 pages in that anthology for his poems. Only 2 other people received more than 6 pages. Most entries received 2 or 3 pages. In 1960, there was Langston Hughes, and then there was everybody else in the African-American imagination for successful poets. Now, one of the thrilling things I get to do is I get to hold primary documents in my hands. I had to wear white gloves when handling this document, but this is the handwritten draft of Langston Hughes's most popular poem, A Dream Deferred. As you look over this, I'm going to point out some things pretty specifically that I think you'll be interested in. First of all, can you imagine my excitement when I was going through the folders at Yale University and was the first person to realize that this had been preserved in over 800 boxes of Langston Hughes's items? I'm sitting there in my seat holding this item in my hands, shaking, because I'm realizing that Langston Hughes knew right away he'd done something amazing. Look at the top of this image. You'll see a star with a circle. It's just, Langston Hughes said, this is really good. Don't lose this thread. Hold on to this idea. The top left-hand corner has all these staple marks because it kept getting stapled to previous revisions of the poem. Every time Langston Hughes would type up a new draft, he'd put this one on top to make sure he didn't lose any imagery or rhythm. Now, we're going to look really closely at this because I do want to give you a view of what a scholar goes through to write these kind of books. You'll see that Langston Hughes asked the question, does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? But look what took me 11 months to figure out. He then wrote, or does it fester like a sore then run? Look back at this conglomeration of letters here. Langston Hughes actually wrote the words R-O-T, rot. This line was supposed to go, or does it rot? And then mid-thought, without erasing, he just went over and said, or does it fester? Now he comes back to the idea of rot down here. Does it stink like rotten meat? Now why might this be significant? Well, as Alice knows very well, this poem may very well begin where the famous anti-lynching song, Strange Fruit, ends. In that song, made famous by Billie Holiday, she says, "Here is fruit for the sun to rot." The idea of the lynched body hanging from a tree with all that magnolia scent is a notion of fruit that can't be recognized. And when Billie Holiday ends that song by singing, "Here is fruit for the sun to rot, for the wind to suck," Langston Hughes may very well be picking up his poem right where that song ends, with the notion of raisin and with the notion of rotting. I'm not going to go too deeply into it right now, but I'm going to talk about one other thing in just a second. Why is that highly possible, that this poem surprisingly updates what's happening with lynching in the 1950s? Well, it may be arguing that in the 1950s, now they found a way to lynch our dreams and our hopes. Whereas the body had been the subject throughout the 20s, 30s, and 40s, Langston Hughes may be engaging in the first time ever that the Tuskegee Committee said there were no actual lynchings in the year of 1951. Bombings and other kinds of threats and domestic terrorism had replaced it. Why else might this be a possibility in this response to Billie Holiday? Langston Hughes kept 2 photographs on his studio. One was a picture of Billie Holiday. I have a copy of it behind me on my shelf. I won't show it to you. He loved Billie Holiday. He would quote from that song all the way through the mid-1950s and other plays. he knew strange fruit by heart. Second, he kept another photograph up in his studio, a photograph of a love interest, a woman named Elsie Roxborough. Elsie had started a relationship with Langston Hughes and proposed to him no less than 3 times. Playwright author Arthur Miller, the person who wrote Death of a Salesman, said of Elsie Roxborough that she was the most stunningly beautiful woman in all of Ann Arbor, Michigan when he was there. How beautiful and famous was she? She was reportedly dating boxer Joe Louis just before she started interacting with Langston Hughes. Elsie Roxborough would be refuted by Langston Hughes for marriage. It became scandalous at one point when it was announced in African-American newspapers that the two were engaged, and Langston Hughes had to drive up personally to Michigan to remind her that he was not going to accept her proposal of marriage. Eventually, unfortunately, Miss Roxborough died from uncertain causes, whether it was simply a drug overdose or suicide. But Langston Hughes was so moved by her relationship with him that she took her photograph and put it upstairs out of reach and would not answer questions about it to people who had the privilege of visiting the studio. The last thing I want to say about this image is this. If you know this poem well, maybe you've seen it in a classroom in the past, you'll know that Langston Hughes ends with the idea in his final version, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it sag like a heavy load, or does it explode? But look at this handwritten version. The end of it is on the next page. Langston Hughes originally wrote, or does it atom-like explode? He was thinking of nuclear war because this poem that you're looking at was written by his hand on August 7th, 1948, only 3 years after the destruction at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nuclear weapons and bombs were very much on his mind, and we wonder how interesting an image that is of African American identity being so pressed and so squeezed that it's about ready to explode like a bomb, incinerating everything around it. Langston Hughes probably moved away from this opening image because explosion became more ambiguous, became more suggestive of any number of different kinds of ways that things could explode. So one of the great things I got to do in this book is I finally got to publish this drafted version in here so that people could see it. I'd had a chance to write about it before, but only by a book asking for 35 photographs, we were able to show what this image looked like. And I was thrilled to show the world one of the most important poems ever written in the 20th century in its original form. Let me say one more thing kind of as a side note, because this is all kind of comfortable and relaxed. It's staggering when you hold these documents in your hand, the protocols you have to go through. So I had to wear white gloves so that none of the materials, waxes, oils on your hands get on these sources. You sit at a table in which there's a camera above in the ceiling, and they make a chart at the library desk of which person is at every desk, which materials, so that nothing disappears or vanishes. You literally can only walk in with a pencil and blank paper. It can't even be a notebook with silver rings on it because that could scratch or damage materials, and you can't take an ink pen in case it explodes or spills over things. Why are those kind of protocols put in place? Well, because at less substantive libraries, materials disappear. And I'll be talking about that in just a little bit. Other key documents I went looking for that should have been there have been stolen, and it's very frustrating to the historical record. So I get to look at items like this, and it becomes quite unique in this regard. The next thing I want to do, if you'll bear with me, a lot of folks are always kind of interested in process. And so I want to show you just about a minute of some of the types of physical, handwritten research I do to keep track of everything. How does he keep track of the poem being written in 1948 but not published until 1951? Why is it important when things like A Raisin in the Sun are happening? So what you're going to look at is a screenshot. In person, I sometimes bring this in, but what you're going to look at is a number of images from a 14-foot scroll I have. It's called the Dream Scroll, and it tracks every single connection between Dr. King and Langston Hughes that I was able to find over the course of 8 years. And this thing is butcher paper. It's 14 feet long and 3 feet tall, and it breaks down every month from 1955 until 1968, where there's some connection between Langston Hughes and Martin Luther King. You'll hear the voice of Langston Hughes once again, but I want you to just kind of note these things. It's quite interesting. One technique that I use is using a lot of different colors to code threads and thoughts. And it's also interesting, I think you'll find that even in this age, in 2020, when we have so much technological advances, that I still work a lot with simply paper and pen. So here's a few images of some of my research along the way.
Bring me all of your dreams, you dreamers. Bring me all of your heart melodies, that I may wrap them in a blue cloud cloth, away from the too rough fingers of the world. And that is what courting may do. Wrap up your dreams, protect and preserve them, and hold them until maybe they come true. Columbus dreamed of finding a new world. He found it. Edison dreamed of light, more light, and he made light. All the progress that human beings have made on this old earth of ours grew out of dreams. That is why it is wise, I should think, to hold fast to dreams. For if dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly. Hold fast to dreams, for when dreams go, life is a barren field, frozen with snow.
I want to pause this document right here before moving on. It's always startling to be alerted to how often history begins with a death. When we go back to the boycott of the buses by Rosa Parks, she would cite the lynching of Emmett Till as motivation. When we go back to what led to a number of things happening in the spring of 1963 around Birmingham, we start remembering incidents and events around Medgar Evers, and that leading to a real focus for the March on Washington. The more difficult death for even astute members who studied the civil rights movement of the 60s is the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson. We've had a lot of really important discussions recently about John Lewis and what happened at the 3 different marches to Selma. We sometimes forget that that was generated by the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson in this particular time period surrounding this notion of what was going on in Alabama. So keeping track of all these dates and ideas was significant. Here's why it was significant for me, and I'll be brief. Dr. Martin Luther King used no less than 7 different poems by Langston Hughes in his speeches and sermons from 1956 to 1968. The one that was confusing me the most was, why was Dr. King referring to dreams deferred and shattered dreams in April of 1959? If I were to slide this scroll forward and get to the chronological date here, and go back to April 5th of 1959, I'd find that this is the first time Dr. King ever preached about dreams. And his preaching about dreams was not optimistic, hopeful, inspirational, and it was not a quotation from the Bible. It shocked me to find out that what he had actually been doing is he had actually been riffing on Langston Hughes' final idea of dreams that explode. The thesis for his sermon on that Sunday, April 5th, 1959, was, "Who here has not been the victim of shattered dreams and blasted hopes?" And he mentioned Langston Hughes by name in that long sermon. That was his first engagement with dreams. Now, this scroll helped me figure out why it happened then. Dr. King had just come back from India, and his first Sunday back was Palm Sunday. So he had to give a Palm Sunday sermon. The next Sunday back after India was Easter, so he gave an Easter sermon. But something had happened right away when he came back, and that was the aforementioned debut of A Raisin in the Sun. The play's success had hit Broadway instantaneously. Dr. King had taken notice, and he wanted to bring in the ideas of Langston Hughes' idea from his poem, A Raisin in the Sun and Dreams Exploding, into his sermons and ideas. Now, here's how detailed this stuff gets. I know this will shock many of you, but it shouldn't, listening to what Alice talked about in her detailed and incredibly insightful research. A few years ago, I had a graduate student go back and look at every newspaper Dr. King read from March 11th until April 5th. We knew that he took two papers daily, the Montgomery Advertiser and the New York Times. He read them every day, no matter what. He had to know what was going on in the world and the country. We documented every time the play A Raisin in the Sun was mentioned in either of those newspapers, and we found out over and over again that people were reviewing and talking about the play that had seen unprecedented integrated audiences, splitting sometimes 55% white, 45% black, unlike Broadway had ever seen for integrated audiences. And that play was reviewed as being a play about shattered dreams. It was stunning to look across the screen and see that people were talking about that play as a play being about shattered dreams, and then hearing Dr. King on his first free Sunday talking about people being the victim of shattered dreams. So these cultural, historical moments overlap with art and politics and poetry in these particular ways. Very briefly, Langston Hughes is very much at the center of politics because one of his most important poems has been used for a long time in terms of a campaign slogan. This is Langston Hughes' poem, Let America Be America Again, written in 1936, being spoken by Dr. King on April 4th, 1967. Here's how Dr. King sometimes invoked the words of Langston Hughes.
In 1957, when a group of us formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, we chose as our motto to save the soul of America. In a way, we were agreeing with Langston Hughes, that black bard of Harlem, who had written earlier, oh yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be.
So it's quite fascinating that in 1967, Dr. King could be so direct by naming Langston Hughes and quoting that poem, because for the majority of his career, Dr. King could not reference the name of Langston Hughes. From exactly April of 1960 until March 15th of 1965, Dr. King never named Langston Hughes or quoted directly from any of his poems because Dr. King at that time was under the greatest FBI surveillance of his life for being accused of being associated with communists, subversives, and anti-American personalities. Langston Hughes had earned that reputation of being subversive because of the moment that this photograph captures. On March 26, 1953, Langston Hughes was brought to appear before Joseph McCarthy and was seen by the world as somebody that had actively engaged and sympathized with the communist cause. The rhetoric and language of that time period has never really gone away, and that reputation smeared Langston Hughes for years and influenced the way he has been received. So let's step back here for a second. How did Langston Hughes cross over from being a voice of African Americans to becoming someone that white America would embrace? Well, it starts from the very beginning. Even as much as we would like to say that Langston Hughes succeeded as a voice of Black America on his own terms, the reality is that from the very beginning of his career, and remember he was famous at the age of 20, at the very beginning of his career, he was dependent upon white patronage. and white support to argue his cause to publishers. And so one of his great advocates was a man named Carl van Vechten, a photographer of great renown and an author himself, who spent a great majority of his life documenting and taking photographs of great African-American artists, musicians, singers, and painters throughout the Harlem Renaissance. And he was so impressed at hearing Langston Hughes's poem at that 1925 poetry contest, The Weary Blues, that he immediately talked to Langston Hughes and said, "Do you have more poems like these?" Langston Hughes said yes to this white patron. They met 2 weeks later, and in another 3 weeks, his book was under contract with Knopf Publishers. So even though Langston Hughes is the voice for African Americans, to make it through that gatekeeping process of publication, he was dependent upon white patronage and acceptance in this regard. How happy was Langston Hughes? Well, he wrote in his personal journals, "I had to walk sideways to keep from flying." Once he found out his book was going to be published, he said, "I had to walk sideways to keep from flying down the street" in this regard. And do you notice the way Langston Hughes physically appears here? This thin mustache, his glasses, his books in front of him. One of the things I was really excited about with this biography is I read about 4 other biographies that have recently come out, and I said, what's happening in the world of biography? What's going on now that's interesting, that's different than all the biographies we've ever seen since James Boswell first wrote the first ever biography on Samuel Johnson because he had access to his letters. And I found that really prescient biographies being published today tell personal stories about the people. And so one of the most interesting things I did is I took an entire day and I looked at every photograph I could find of Langston Hughes from his birth to his death. And I took down this pen, it really is the same one, I'm not being dramatic. And I wrote down all the differing features that changed throughout his lifetime. The width of his ties in the 1950s, when ties got wide. The development of his mustache when it wasn't there or got thick or thinned out. The moment in time when he had bridge work done and dentures put in. And so when he smiled, he looked different when he posed for photographs in front of the great Henry Carter Brescian. And how he smoked. Hughes always put the cigarette on the left side of his lip. And I wrote in the book, he put it on the left side so that his words would come out right. So I tried to throw in a lot of these little details so you could trace Hughes's development through cultural changes. And you'll see in the book a real attentiveness to kind of fashion, mustaches, glasses, and dental work to try to bring this incredible person to life. How incredible? Well, the entire collection of Robert Frost's poems would fit in the space between my fingers that you can see on the screen. He wrote approximately 700 poems over the course of 70 years. Langston Hughes's complete works make up 17 volumes of works. That would be 3.5 feet, a space you cannot see between my hands because it's too wide for the screen. Langston Hughes accomplished this by starting his writing about midnight and then finishing between 6:30 and 7:30 in the morning. It was the only time he could not be interrupted. Then he would sleep in till noon and then meet his obligations for radio interviews, talks, conferences, other things, and then repeat the process at night. So 58 books to his name when he died as editor, author, curator of things. Now what I want to do is I want to take you to one of Langston Hughes's most important poems and give you one more chance to hear him read. And then I'm going to move through to the local Langston Hughes, and then that'll get us ready for some questions and discussion. Here is a poem that's been made incredibly famous, and it's really in our consciousness right now. It's a poem called I Too. In this incredibly short poem, you'll hear Langston Hughes responding to the great Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman had written a poem called I Hear America Singing. Langston Hughes loved Walt Whitman, When he traveled overseas for the first time, Langston Hughes threw all the books he owned overboard because he didn't want to have the weight and the baggage, but the one book he refused to throw away was Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. In that poem, Walt Whitman says, I hear America singing, I hear the woodworker, I hear the seamstress, and he listed a whole litany of people, but to Langston Hughes's ears, he did not hear Whitman list blacks. And so Langston Hughes's poem begins where Walt Whitman's ends, saying, there's one other category you forgot, and it's me. Langston Hughes's poem, I Too.
I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful we are and be ashamed. I too am America.
Now those last two lines, I'm going to just work really hard here not to get too excited. September 24th of 2016, a new museum opened in Washington, D.C. called the National Museum of African American History and Culture. That museum was being inaugurated and dedicated on that day, and an unbelievable thing happened when I turned on my television to watch those ceremonies. The person who offered the opening prayer quoted two Langston Hughes poems from memory. When Will Smith came on stage standing shoulder to shoulder with Oprah Winfrey, he quoted Langston Hughes's poem, Dream Deferred, from memory. When the director of the museum stepped up for the most important professional moment of his life, where this museum had finally opened, Lonnie Bunch's first pre-planned words were, what has been a dream too long deferred is a dream no longer. Finally, President Obama, who was president at the time in September of 2016, was speaking for 25 minutes at the end of the ceremony. All he had to do was make one or two references to Langston Hughes, and the entire event would have been something that was pretty much a dedication to Langston Hughes. Instead, he did something unheard of. In the only speech in American history delivered by a sitting president, he centered his entire speech around a single poem. That poem is a poem you have in front of you. Barack Obama's speech, a substantive one, not random comments, said that we too are America. We too are Americans. Why had this happened? Well, if you have the pleasure or have had the fortune of already touring that museum, when you go past the Tuskegee Airman airplane that's hanging at the very top floor, the last thing everyone that visits that museum sees as they leave is this entire poem, 55 feet tall, in brass gold letters on the wall. The museum took its entire inspiration from this idea that we too belong on the National Mall. We too are Americans. So it was a little surprise then that the New York Times, the day before that event, took out an entire page of its newspaper and published only this poem. Eschewing all advertising dollars and everything else, the poem takes up about 20% of an entire page in the New York Times because they were setting the tables for what was about to happen. Let's bring Langston Hughes home locally. I'll move quickly here, and then in about 5 or 10 minutes, we'll take questions and begin our discussion. One of the more interesting things about any subject you work on is how it has ties to where you physically are. Langston Hughes has remarkable ties to the state of North Carolina. More than I can document here, but let's take on two of them. Number one, this is an image of Langston Hughes taken on Franklin Street in Chapel Hill. This church, I know it's faded. Remember, this is 1932 when this picture is taken. This church still stands as the Presbyterian Church on the campus side of Franklin Street. This is Langston Hughes on the left, and this is an editor of a newspaper that had asked Langston Hughes to submit something about what was a case of the times called the Scottsboro case. At that particular time, Langston Hughes was asked to write something about the Scottsboro Boys, a group of 9 youths falsely accused of raping 2 women, Victoria Price and Ruby Bates. They were convicted and reconvicted and tried and tried over and over for a crime they didn't commit. Langston Hughes had an unbelievably controversial appearance in Chapel Hill in this particular year. It said, in fact, that Langston Hughes was the first African American to ever eat in a restaurant on Franklin Street. How did he do that? Langston Hughes spoke fluent Spanish. And what he would do when he wanted to pass is he would immediately begin by speaking Spanish so that the owners and workers would think he was from either Spain or Mexico and allow that and not realize he was actually an African American. Langston Hughes's poem was on the center of this magazine, and this magazine was printed and published in 5,000 copies and then distributed the very day that Langston Hughes appeared in Chapel Hill. It was a back and forth affair. Langston Hughes was invited to read at Memorial Auditorium, the building that's still there. People on campus said, we can't have a subversive anti-American person come, so they banned him. Finally, students protested, and they got him into the Smalley Gerard Hall, a hall which still stands right by the old well on campus. This poem was unbelievably controversial. Langston Hughes had argued that the real problem of the South was not African-American men falsely raping white women. It was white plantation owners having children with their black mistresses. He turned the sexual implications on their head and said, why do we have so many mulatto mixed children? It's because of white plantation owners taking advantage of their black workers. This poem was hot. Released the same day Langston Hughes appeared in person, police had to stand guard around Gerard Hall. Langston Hughes got over the event by smiling, laughing, telling jokes, and not reading this poem out loud. But it was such a problem that the governor of both North Carolina got involved and said maybe this magazine should be shut down. And eventually, even months afterwards, people were writing letters to the editor saying Langston Hughes should be tarred and feathered. And that was an important bit of tracking throughout the text that we had. But one fascinating thing came out of this. And sometimes you get to work on a personality that's so open and kind that it just inspires you to finish writing. Langston Hughes was invited to speak by a man named Guy Johnson, a sociologist at Chapel Hill. And he said, hey, the people that donated your $32.50 speaking fee, the last speaking fee Langston Hughes would ever get from a white university, he said they had to really go out to do this. There was a controversy and problems, and the largest donation we got was $1.50. He said, Mr. Hughes, would you write one of your poems, sign it, send it to me, and I'll make mimeograph copies and give it to all 32 people that donated. And Langston Hughes said, no, I'll do far better than that. I'll write an individual poem by hand for every single person that donated 50 cents, 75 cents, $1.50. Now what happened is when Langston Hughes set those back, he was riding in the passenger seat because he never learned how to drive, and so he had plenty of time on his hands as he was touring the South. He wrote these and returned these, but some of these poems were never given to their rightful owner because they couldn't be found or didn't collect them. And so this is one of the poems Langston Hughes wrote out by hand to give to one of the patrons who helped bring him to our area. And you'll see it signed at the bottom, and it's handwritten, and it's over in the Wilson Library over in Chapel Hill. Now, you can tell a lot about this kind of kindness, and you can also tell about how efficient Langston Hughes was. He would cross his T and then start the H of his last name all in one motion to be as efficient as possible with his time. And so you get to dig up these kind of autographed documents, which are still out there in this particular way and become unique for us in this regard. The last thing I'm going to mention is this, and it previews a little bit of my future research. Langston Hughes' most new connections, which I'm exploring right now, are between himself and North Carolina's own singer, Nina Simone. Now, I mentioned this when I did the book launch for this event in Washington, D.C. at Busboys and Poets, and then again at Quail Ridge Books before all the rest of the book events were canceled in March and April following this up. And people were aghast that they did not know that Langston Hughes had played such a central role in Nina Simone's career. And based on that expression of people's faces and questions, I said, I need to go back and do some more research here because people are really anxious and excited about this. So events like this and talking to you often inspire the next book projects or work that I'm doing. I'll say this very succinctly and then we'll move on to the questions and the answers. Langston Hughes had incredible interactions with North Carolina's own Nina Simone. If you don't know, Nina Simone was born in Tryon, North Carolina, and was educated in high school at Asheville. These two people met when Nina Simone was 14 years old. She was part of a group that brought Langston Hughes in to speak through what was then called Negro Week in that particular year. And Langston Hughes appeared right in front of Nina Simone when she was 14 years old, reading his poems to her in Asheville. Later on, this connection grew when Langston Hughes, well before others, wrote what you have as the first draft in front of you, this pink sheet. Langston Hughes, as a person who wrote newspaper articles weekly for over 42 years, had the power of the pen nationally to bring attention to key figures. And he wrote about Nina Simone before she was famous, talking about how amazing she was. And this article that came out in 1960 cemented Nina Simone as a legitimate artist. Nobody else had spoke out on her behalf before Langston Hughes. What you see in front of you is Langston Hughes revising his statement for 1964 to go on the back of an album Nina Simone is releasing. In 1964, she's doing a work called Broadway Ballads and Ballads, and these blues songs that are featured now have Langston Hughes crossing out Ernie Banks, who was more popular in 1960, and now putting in a name like Willie Mays, who was more popular in 1964. It's adding in the emergence of Leroy Jones, somebody who was not on the scene in 1960, now is critical in 1964, and making all these changes. And so right now I'm going through documents like this and many, many others to really quantify the letters these two exchanged and talked about the reciprocating role between the two. I'll give away one little thing and then we'll move on and be finished with this portion. Briefly, Nina Simone started singing Langston Hughes's poems. And one of her most famous songs is literally a poem Langston Hughes wrote and gave to Nina Simone personally. And so the development of that contact is really significant to Nina Simone's success in life that we have for us in this particular regard. So with that, I would like to move on to questions, comments, and discussion. I'm always amazed at what knowledge folks have out there, so I'm all ears listening as much as being able to answer things. And you know, we may get into some really important topics about either the process of writing or Langston Hughes or many of the incredible figures he got to know. So I'll turn it over to you for questions, comments, discussion. And this is always the most exciting part for me.
Well, I wanted to say thank you, Jason, for that incredible presentation. You always wow us. Are there questions in the group? And if you want to, you can raise your hand and go ahead and unmute yourself and ask Jason a question. We're very casual here.
Oh, can I ask a question?
Please, Bridget.
Thanks. I wanted to see if Jason would talk a little bit, your presentation focused a lot on his poetry, but he also wrote like short stories like the Jesse B. Simple series. Could you talk about kind of the impact of his stories?
Absolutely, and you couldn't be more on time here. He also wrote the lyrics to famous plays, and 18 of Langston Hughes's plays had been performed throughout his lifetime, including 5 works on Broadway. And so Langston Hughes was intimately involved with the song lyrics. The year that this play debuted, Langston Hughes had written the Broadway song of the year, Moon-Faced Starry-Eyed. All of Broadway had the most famous song of the year that written by Langston Hughes. The actual articles you mentioned so astutely about Jesse B. Simple are some of my favorites, and it was just thrilling to go back and look at them. So here's one from 1957. These again came out weekly based on a very real encounter Langston Hughes had at Patty's Bar and Grill with the figure, and then Langston Hughes began this dialogue between this Harlemite he invented, Just Be Simple, and then this man named Boyd that eventually developed. And Langston Hughes took on weekly, daily events all the time. And these newspaper articles were critical. Here you'll see a poem in the bottom left that he had published earlier and he's redoing. But then what's also fascinating is he will sometimes in these articles publish poems that he never published anywhere else. And so there are all these accesses to things. And to just give you a sense of how funny Langston Hughes could be, as you know so well, here's what Langston Hughes wrote. If I get the sense right, answered Simple, the grammar can take care of itself. There are plenty of Jim Crowers who speak fine grammar, but do very evil. I have not had enough schooling to put words together right, but I know some white folks who went to school 40 years and who do not do right. I figure it is better to do right than to write right. To act right is better than to talk correct, is it not? And so you get these levels of humor that are just really quite remarkable. And then one other thing I'll mention to your incredibly insightful comment is that we have this whole other genre as well of short stories. And this is a picture of Langston Hughes on the beach at Carmel by the Sea, California. He spent 11 months writing a series of short stories based on his reading of D.H. Lawrence's work. And that collection of short stories was known as The Ways of White Folks, perhaps a revision to W.B. Du Bois's notion of the souls of black folks. Langston Hughes titled it The Ways of White Folks. And so, yes, so astute, newspaper articles, lyrics for the stage, songs that were sometimes performed by Paul Robeson at Madison Square Garden, short stories, absolutely couldn't have been more on point with your insight there. Unbelievably broad and beyond the genre of poetry. I'm so glad you noted that.
Can you also talk a little bit about his relationship and friendship with Zora Neale Hurston?
Yeah, I really can. And this is just more fascinating to us every month. The class that I teach here is called Langston Hughes from Popular Culture to the Civil Rights Movement. And so I do a graduate seminar on that every year and a half. And I do an undergraduate course on it every semester. And every time, students are never more fascinated than they are by this relationship with Zora Neale Hurston. It's a long one to really encapsulate. But the most recent research is one that I try to offer as kind of providing insight. We talked about patronage earlier. Langston Hughes, along with many other African Americans in the 1920s, accepted financial support from a white patron known as Charlotte Mason.
Good, yes.
She demanded that the people that took money from her referred to as godmother. She was really powerful because her husband had died and passed on a legacy of finances, and she saw as her arm to try to promote African-American works across the arts. Little beknownst to people, even people like Aaron Douglas took money from her for a while. However, her patronage often got to be incredibly consuming and overt and too hands-on. Rather than saying, you're the expert in the field, here's some support, go do the research, she often got every finger of her hands into the work, demanding how it should be changed. So Zora Neale Hurston, when she was not famous, approached Langston Hughes saying, "Would you please help me write a play?" Langston Hughes was famous and well-established and known for his fascination with the theater. The greatest financial gains Langston Hughes would ever receive would come from the theater. He made the most money he ever made off of that street scene play, the first time he could buy a house in 1948. And he made even more money off Black Nativity, a play that since its inception in the 1960s has never been out of production. This might be the first year it's not produced because of COVID. It's been on my campus every year. But to go back to the story. Langston Hughes says, "Yes, I'll help you with the play." Zora Neale Hurston has all the main plot ideas. She's looking for Langston Hughes to add dialogue or insight and music and rhythm and compress the things. 3 people are working on the play: Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, and another figure named Louise Thompson. Louise Thompson is literally typing up revisions and making changes, so she's there testifying to it being a collaborative work. Zora Neale Hurston leaves. She stops work on it, stops communicating, disappears, and the next thing Langston Hughes hears is he is in bed sick in Cleveland, Ohio, with his tonsils removed from a bad case of tonsillitis. And he finds that the play is actually going to be produced in the very city he is in Cleveland, Ohio. And he's like, what? How did we go from working on a play to it's in production in the same city I'm literally laying in a bed in? There are many ways to try to guess at Zora Neale Hurston's motivations. Here's what we know now. At the very least, this was the only thing she was physically holding on to as something of her own, because Charlotte Mason had really plunged her fingers into her first ethnographic study, and that was not going the way Zora hoped. The pressure on Zora was immense. She had to do something on her own, and she was in a really tight constraint in this particular way. However, there is no going about the business that she repeatedly lied about the process of the involvement of Langston Hughes in this particular play. The play goes from being produced to being scandalous, to drawing in other people, to the theater finally saying, if we don't know who published this thing, we can't produce it, to actually never being produced until years later when it comes forward. It really damaged the relationship between Hughes and Hurston forever. What became of this was quite noteworthy. Years afterwards, Zora Neale Hurston would really look back at this time and talk about it in different ways to different folks. But what became noteworthy most recently, these are someone else's ideas, not mine, is a man named Yuval Taylor, and this was the actual last quotes I had to insert in the book. We were like 2 months out from actually going into production. I said, there's a new book out, we have to quote from it or we'd look like idiots, okay? And this man suggests 2 things. He suggests that Zora Neale Hurston wanted this play to be her own because everything else around her was being taken from her as a Black woman at the time. That seems very interesting and noteworthy. And second, he asserts the very strong possibility that Zora was in love with Langston Hughes and had grown jealous of how close he was coming to Louise Thompson.
I've heard that before. The
person that was typing things up, Zora may have become very frustrated by the whole process, and so who knows, but that's where we're at in the conversation and discussion. The play is called Mulebone. You're not going to believe this out there if you're not familiar with the story. The play is called Mulebone, and the plot is about 2 people who get in an argument over who killed a turkey. And so, I mean, you talk about life overcoming art. The play is about an argument that can't be settled, and then that's what solved it all the way around. Thank you so much for your remarkable insight. You really know a lot about Langston Hughes.
Yes, thank you.
Other questions, Tommy?
Other questions we have for Jason?
Jason, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah, I'm Jorge. Thank you for the book. It's a fascinating read. It's a great job of scholarship, and I was fascinated by reading the primary materials and seeing the pictures also. And there was a lot in the book that was surprising to me. We seem to be more fascinated with James Baldwin than with Langston Hughes for reasons that I don't clearly understand. As I read the book, and this is my own perception of the biography, I realized that if Langston is a man of extraordinary talent, but if he will be the hero of a novel, his fault will be that he always tried to control his public image throughout his life, his sexuality, his, his life fascination with communism or socialism. I mean, he was, it's obvious because he traveled to the USSR. And later on, his connection with Martin Luther King. Is that it has impaired maybe Langston Hughes to have that sort of protective attitude with so many things? What do you think?
Really insightful comments. Thank you for those. I'll take them one at a time. I too am really struck at how much James Baldwin is exploding in our imaginations. One avenue of this probably has to do with just the lack of scholarship prior to this. There is people recognizing just the unbelievable gap in this particular realm, and recapturing the notions of James Baldwin is really important. James Baldwin, just as a side note, was the only other person to not get along with Langston Hughes. Along in that category was Zora Neale Hurston. And it speaks to my turn. Langston Hughes had written a very honest review of how he felt about James Baldwin. James Baldwin took it personally and then slammed Langston Hughes's collection, Selected Poems in 1959, saying it was a terrible piece of work, and later confessed he'd never even read the book. He just wanted to get even with Hughes. There's an incident where Baldwin runs into Langston Hughes at a bar, and everyone around said, Baldwin acted like a young child caught in bad company by his father, that he really felt guilty about this. So that's interesting. But let's move to the second point, which I think is kind of an infinite dilemma for people in Langston Hughes studies. One of the previous works talked about Langston Hughes stuck between this notion of being authentic and compromising. And where does he choose to compromise, and where does he choose to be authentic in this regard? It was a startling burden for Langston Hughes. Let's take a couple of those wonderful, insightful topics you raised. Number one, sexuality. This is difficult for us, and it was by far the most difficult thing I had to tackle in this book. The British folks really wanted me to talk about Langston Hughes' sexuality, and they weren't going to let me off the hook because they just have kind of different standards for talking about these things. I finally came around to it because I realized that nobody in my field will really talk about these things and get them as accurate as we know now. Here's what I settled on in terms of this. One way to understand Hughes's privacy around sexuality is to think about the era in which he was dealing with this, which was the 1920s. And what I did on those pages in the book is I quoted about 8 other musicians or artists at the time who said, my sexuality is no one else's business in 1924 and 1925, including really prominent figures who you would think would not care about their on-stage presence. And that was insightful to me, this notion of not protecting or not protecting, but just off limits in this regard. We have to remember on that front that throughout the 50s, and I gathered this from reading a lot of other biographies on people who dealt with the same issue, that homosexuality was literally illegal. It was outed by psychiatric departments as being a sociological psychopathic behavior. The pink purge of government officials, how many people were being fired in the 1950s. It's such a drastic situation to where we are in terms of sexuality that I think it has to be contextualized. But the last thing I'll add is this. I too feel all the emotions you did in terms of Hughes wanting to be liked. It's very strange. And the closest I've come to this has been thinking about many other people I've interacted with personally in terms of what they choose to say about their lives and what they don't. And I'm becoming more and more convinced by other people, like a couple of journalists in Memphis who I've talked to about people who knew Dr. King very well, that a lot of times it comes down to just absolute personality traits. And I hate to give an answer that's as basic as that, but it is startling how many people are just extroverted, bring it on, I can handle it, and how many people are just very quiet and introverted in this regard. The only other complication I can bring to the conversation is this. I in no way can imagine what Langston Hughes may or may not have felt for decades, standing in as kind of the representative of African-American letters. Now, I don't mean to oversimplify things. There are all kinds of important personalities throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s. But when you look at those early 1960s and you ask yourself, who is really carrying the banner? I think in many ways, Langston Hughes had an unusual burden in being really seen as kind of a dean of African-American poetry. And of course, we have Gwendolyn Brooks, Robert Hayden, lists of names that will go on in terms of incredible contributors and unbelievable talents that become more and more important. But the face of things, you know, I'll end with this for this question. I reread the stuff from the 1960s on Langston Hughes, and some of this I had to get translated out of France. The first scholars on Langston Hughes were out of France. I was just stunned to revisit this. 1963 was the first book on Langston Hughes. It's published by a French scholar in Paris. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. And way back then, those people are writing over and over again lines that I just quote and leave out there. That is, that to the world, in the 1960s, Langston Hughes was what an African-American writer looked like. And the scope of Hughes beyond America, to the Caribbean, to Central America, even to places like Japan and China, where his works were translated, to Russia, where his works were translated, to Germany and the Dutch language that it was translated in, he didn't even know it. It was an unusual burden. And again, I hope I've said that correctly. There are a whole host of people out there, but I think in many ways, Langston Hughes had a ton of burden. I really welcome that insight, and it's something I've wrestled with very personally, and that's really as much as I can offer. It's an ongoing conundrum, and I'm glad you tuned into it.
Jason, this is Alice Irby.
Hello.
I have a question. It's the last paragraph in chapter 8 that has to do with the Obama dream speech during the Democratic Convention. And you write that Obama's reference to Hughes's dream deferred cast the poet as an unfortunate adversary to hope and change. It appeared that his ideas were the ones that bemoaned fate rather than inspired and exhorted listeners to action. How did that come about, and why was that? That really surprised me.
Thank you so much for that. What a group we have. I'll stay as long as you want to stay. I mean, your readership intensity out there is fantastic. So here's the background, Alice, and it's unbelievable because it's actually happened since the book came out. I tasked a graduate student 8 months ago. I said, find out for us when it became safe to reference Langston Hughes in a political context. So here's the background. For decades, you could not name Langston Hughes as a politician in a government context. Barack Obama, in his first term, would never talk about Langston Hughes positively because the upstage of this is Langston Hughes had been derided across all government cycles as a communist, socialist, anti-American subversive. Now, this is well documented. Even when John Kerry tried to use the phrase, "Let America be America" again in his campaign, he had to drop it. There was a Republican named Rick Santorum that ran for office that said, "Make America Great." The next day, when they found out that phrase was linked to Langston Hughes' poetry, he had to drop the slogan immediately because you're using the words of a gay, homosexual, anti-American, subversive communist. You know the list of words. So this finally changed, and it did not change then. It didn't change then because Langston Hughes still had the reputation of being this subversive outsider. So here's what happened. This student went back and he looked at every single reference to Langston Hughes because what started to happen in 2016 is you could start to mention Langston Hughes again. When Tim Kaine delivered Hillary Rodham Clinton's speech declining that she was going to win the presidential race, he quoted from Hold Fast to Dreams. So we had 2008 where you couldn't say Hughes, and 2016 where you could. I said, when did that switch? And here's what happened. It was social media. I know it's a phrase you all want to hear me say. In 2012, after the horrific killing of Trayvon Martin, social media started latching on to a Langston Hughes poem entitled Kids Who Die. That poem went viral in the coming weeks and went everywhere, and suddenly a new triangle formed. Trayvon Martin, Langston Hughes, and this idea of politics. And suddenly, anybody that spoke against Langston Hughes was now speaking against Trayvon Martin. And so Trayvon Martin's death, something that could be safely out there, President Obama started testing the waters. And he started using phrases from that poem, and he started speaking out against Trayvon Martin. And all of a sudden, you could no longer attack politicians because then you were attacking the murder of Trayvon Martin. So this guy nailed it. I mean, he just nailed it. He got it right down to the month and time. And since that moment, again, this was even deep into President Obama not having to worry about a second term. I mean, he was not embracing Langston Hughes, even regardless of having to be reelected. It wasn't until that case took place. So fortunately, we are now in a place where it's politically safe to mention Langston Hughes, and it's all about reputation and perception. Obviously, nothing has changed about Langston Hughes himself. It's quite fascinating the way this happened.
I'm surprised that that label continued with such strength and force for so many years. I mean, there were lots of people that were almost destroyed by McCarthy, but a lot of them were rehabilitated, and Hughes was so productive and so inspiring. It surprises me that that label.
I agree completely, and I'll say this very briefly. It's because the label is more than one label. It's Black, homosexual, anti-American, communist. You got to be both Black and red and gay, right? And so all those labels, people were able to strip away one of those other people. But when you've got those three or four, you're really in the sights. And I agree completely. I was stunned as well in documenting this, and I'm glad things have changed. Well said. Thank you.
I think, you were talking earlier about the difference between Baldwin and Langston Hughes. I'm a journalist, and I met James Baldwin. I interviewed him when I was a high school student, but Baldwin used the exact things that Hughes hid. Baldwin said, I'm Black, I'm gay, and I think he even said he was ugly. I mean, but he was like, I'm using it. And so I think that's part of the difference. And I don't think Baldwin, I think Baldwin had people who helped him. I remember the famous actor. Who is it?
Ossie Davis or Sidney Poitier?
No, it's the white actor.
Sure. Lancaster? Paul Newman?
He played in The Waterfront.
De Niro.
Marlon Brando.
Marlon Brando. That's what I was going to say. He helped him buy a home in France. But I don't think that Baldwin had the patronage of whites. And so he could offend them in ways that I think Hughes could not.
Absolutely. 100% agreed. And I think it really speaks to that notion of personality again. Baldwin's stance was bring it on. I'm here to fight, right? The fire next time. Hughes, I'll just concur and nod with everything you've said. What I can be helpful with is to talk a little bit about Hughes's response. Hughes's feelings about this were, of course, different because I think it's important to remember the age difference between the two. Hughes, I think, would have had that same stance in many regards, despite everything we said about personality. When we look at how he acted in the 1930s, the fairest comparison between the two is say, okay, how outrageous was Langston Hughes in the 1930s when he was about the same age as James Baldwin, right? As opposed to, and so you get that youthful intensity, right? And by the late 60s, Langston Hughes is past that moment, right? And so that intensity was there. And Langston Hughes would remind people in those newspaper articles that you know so well, where was James Baldwin when he was called to talk before James McCarthy, right? Because it's very different to be outed politically in a newspaper article as opposed to having to talk before the Senate.
Right.
And so I love everything you added to the discussion and agree with it completely. And the personality and all those notions is very important. Here's one little side note for you. You can take away if you're not familiar with this, all of you, it's interesting. There are so many side conversations that Hughes would have with friends. His closest friend was a man named Arna Bontemps. And a lot of times they talk about these figures privately. You know, it's like leaning into someone's emails accidentally. And Hughes called James Baldwin the sepia Steinbeck.
I love it. I love it. Yes.
There's a little piece of trivia for you.
Yes.
Thank you for your remarkable insight.
This is Alice again. While we're on this, could you talk a little bit about a passage in the 10th chapter that has to do with Adam Clayton Powell threatening to blackmail Martin Luther King and Hughes's role in that? Had to do with Bayard Rustin as well.
Yes. Thank you so much for reading so astutely out there. I'm really inspired. It's a remarkable scenario of things. I'll tell you the backstory that's not in the book.
That's what I'd like to hear.
So I'm going through these documents, trying to figure out why Dr. King stops mentioning Langston Hughes in April of 1960. So I'm like, what's going on? What's happening here? I got to look at the timeline and the documents. And there was this defense fund, the Committee to Defend Martin Luther King. He'd been attacked on trumped up tax evasion charges. And so there's this letterhead. You remember those old letterheads you'd see on letters with all these people are on members of this committee? And so I had this piece of paper that had all these famous people like Marlon Brando, people like James Baldwin listed on there as people who are supporting the raising money so Dr. King could fight off these fake charges. In February, Langston Hughes' name was on that letterhead. And then I found a letter from May, and Langston Hughes' name had been removed. And I said, what is going on here? Why would Langston Hughes didn't change his opinion on this. And what I found was this unbelievably complicated story. A man named Adam Clayton Powell, and I only understood the story better by doing this book. Even when I'd done the research earlier, I'd only looked at it from King's perspective. Finally, I turned and thought of what it meant to Langston Hughes in this version. Adam Clayton Powell wanted to be named to important roles on Senate committees when he was elected. Adam Clayton Powell represented Langston Hughes' district in the area of near Harlem, New York. Langston Hughes knew Adam Clayton Powell and had actually written jingles for him to win election because he was his guy. He represented his area. And so proximity meant you had that kind of loyalty. Adam Clayton Powell was worried that Dr. King's stance for too much civil rights was going to hurt Adam Clayton Powell as a Black representative. And so he blackmailed Dr. King. He said, I will start the false rumor that you're having a homosexual affair with Bayard Rustin. Right. Completely false, completely not there, but King had to take notice of this because even the implication would have to be fought off, denied, and that was not worth fighting. So this eventually ends with Rustin having to separate from his support of Dr. King because he had been charged for solicitation in the past, and he had been a documented communist. Langston Hughes, in exact terms, was known as Pinko, or a fellow traveler. He was never a card-carrying communist, but Rustin had been. So what I started to realize is, as Rustin separated, that was the exact moment when Langston Hughes had so many similarities. He had these threats about his sexuality. He had his links to the Communist Party. his 13 months in the Soviet Union studying things. And so that became a moment that was really crystal clear for me when I held this document. Dr. King in his own handwriting, which is rare to get a hold of, he's usually dictating things to people, right? But in his own handwriting, he usually wrote on yellow legal paper, 19 lines per page, he'd skip lines, and he usually wrote in pen, green or black. In his own handwriting, he wrote a book called Stride Toward Freedom. And when the book came out, he was thinking of the top 3 people he wanted to review it. Who are famous people out there that will review it, will get this book some publicity. And the first person's name he wrote down was Langhughes. He said, if I can get anybody to review this, I want Langston Hughes to review this. Well, here's what happened. King asked Hughes. Hughes says yes. The book publisher sends Hughes a copy of the book. Hughes reviews it, sends it back. And then when the book comes out, the review isn't there. Hughes says, what happens? Publisher didn't want your name on it. You look a lot like Bayard Rustin. This could be dangerous to have you linked with things. And so this divide had to start happening. What you know so well from reading the book is that King then did the subversive thing of continuing to use Hughes's ideas, right, but not name him and endanger him. And so all the thoughts and themes and ideas are there, not because King wants to steal anything, but because he realizes that has power to the Black community, makes him look like more of an everyday man rather than a PhD doctorate from Boston University. And so you get this really strange circle of things. And it was bizarre to unpack.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Thank you. It's fascinating.
Jason, I have another question. This is moving a little bit outside politics. The book has wonderful photographs, and I have been a photographer and a scientific photographer. And when you mention Henri Cartier-Bresson, it's like talking about a rock star, a god of photography. And the connection between Langston Hughes and him, that's sort of friendship, and the photographs that he includes in some of his work. I'd like to learn a little bit more. The book is so packed of information that I would like to get a little bit of an insight in that connection.
This is going down as one of the all-time best sessions ever. It really is. So, photography. Unbelievably, Langston Hughes met Henry Cartier-Bresson in Mexico City in the 1930s. Hughes's father had moved down there from Joplin, Missouri to start his life, and Hughes was down there visiting him. And lo and behold, there's this photographer that's come down there. He's already had an exhibit, but this is one of his first really important exhibits in Mexico City. And so they're literally hanging out for like a month every night after hours outside of a house, getting to know each other. Langston Hughes writes the introduction to the actual photo exhibit for Bresson. He says, this is a guy with words, let's do this thing. And over the years, we talked about that idea of how do you really get in to know Langston Hughes? And so many people that even spent time with him said they just didn't know on certain topics. He wouldn't talk, he wasn't accessible. What I found is that Henry Cartier-Bresson came closest to documenting what Langston Hughes looked like when he was alone. And what I meant by that phrase is people like Roy DeCarava groveled over the fact that they would shoot photo images of Hughes and they would never get inside of the exterior. He would just have this look and they would never get him to let down his guard. But because of that relationship that the French photographer and Hughes had built, he came the closest, not only because just of his incredible skills, but he would come closest to just getting Langston Hughes to relax a little bit. And let me tell you the backstory. All the photographs I submitted that I wanted on the cover of the book were only ones by Henry Cartier-Bresson. I said, if you really want to get close to what Hughes looked like, we need him in the 50s and 60s and have to be taken by him. And we ran into two things. One was money, because the rights to his photographs were way higher than the one we used. And again, the problem of they don't want a 1960s Hughes, they want the 1920s, 1930s Hughes. But here's more interesting things on this. The two would spend birthdays together and celebrate very intimately. One of Hughes's books is dedicated to Henry Cartier-Bresson and his wife. That's a rare thing in this particular regard. And so they were very, very close. And here's my favorite fun fact about the two. I can't remember if it made it in the book, and I'm not being playful here. It's 13 versions to get the final one out, and I edited out, I think, 110 pages before we got down to what we had. So sometimes I'm not sure what's in there. In about 2001, the US Postal Service started an online, this is when the internet was kind of new, 2001, an online vote to see which poet in America deserved a postage stamp. And so everyone got to go online in 2001 and vote. Langston Hughes won the contest 10-1 over the second place person. People said, Langston Hughes, he's our guy. Now that says a lot about the internet age and people that would vote that way. But the picture they chose is a picture taken by Henry Cartier Bresson. And so I have that 34-cent stamp. You can look it up online. And Hughes has his tweed coat on. He's standing outside in Harlem with the poor teeth. And those are the images that I think are really the best ones we ever had. I lied. I said I had one fun fact. I'm going to give you two, and then I'll be done. Langston Hughes' original collected works came out in 1959. And it's not the image we have now. The image we have now is Langston Hughes sitting at the typewriter. It's the one that's right inside the cover of the book. The first image Langston Hughes had on his collected books was one by Henry Cartier Bresson. He's standing in his studio smoking a cigarette with a ring on his finger with that picture of Elsie just out of the margin. So that is the guy. And I too was stunned in this regard. And it just continued to fascinate me that Hughes would argue and defend for the validity of Roy de Carava's photographs to the point where Hughes probably wrote his Fulbright Guggenheim acceptance grant. It was probably written by Langston Hughes to get him money to do his first major work. So Hughes was deep with photographers, as you know. Thank you for that. Never in a more astute group. I'm not kidding, never. Anything else anybody has? Comments are always welcome to.
I was listening to Hughes's UCLA speech, which was 3 months before he died. And I was so impressed by his generosity and how, Leroy, he was saying, oh, there's a new poet. Her name is Alice Walker. And it was just, and I love how he didn't have to be that way. I mean, I kind of I got the feeling he was a really cool person and a really kind person, just from hearing him. And he made fun of himself. He liked to laugh at his jokes. He'd go, And I just thought he was just a cute person, and a person that other people wanted to be around. And I wanted to, hopefully that's true from your scholarship.
It really is. All the people we could list just found him unbelievable generosity in terms of his time, his commitment, and his real support. As you mentioned, he was proud of the fact that he published Alice Walker's first short story. And so he would talk about, I can claim that I discovered her, even though her own works speak for themselves. But time he spent with Gwendolyn Brooks, time he spent with so many other writers at this particular time. I was quite fascinating to look up a couple facts that even people who would come over and help him move, sometimes when he had to move his belongings from his apartment to the Yale archives, people would end up with autographed copies of his books. And one of these guys that walked away with a copy of his 1960 poetry book ended up becoming the guy so famous that he coined the term woke. And so you find all these lines and linkages to kind of current day to these past particular times. I think it's absolutely indicative of his personality as well as I understand it. And I also think it's born from this notion of understanding how difficult it is to get ahead if you're going to be an African-American writer and all the hoops and things that are out there, and trying to build that kind of camaraderie and relationship. The most famous incident, of course, is the one that happens when Langston Hughes is traveling and gets to meet an incredibly important writer overseas. And when he has this moment to really kind of sit down and talk about these different kind of works and orders of things that happen, it really becomes noteworthy. I guess one other way of thinking of it is this, and I'm more and more struck by this all the time. As we talked about, Hughes as poet, short story writer, journalist, writing things for Broadway, I became more and more surprised at his importance as an editor. And so there's a brand new book that just came out a couple months ago, and it compares the fact that Langston Hughes is the first substantive editor of African literature in America. There were two books that came out right before his, but they wanted to talk about the old history and the oral tales and go way back. Langston Hughes said, no, I want Nigerian, Ghanaian writers that are writing right now. Give me their works and we're going to put them in an anthology. And when that came out in 1960, it is still the first moment that people in North America really got to see African writers in their own contemporary time. And it's a landmark edition, African Treasury is what it's called. And that landmark edition speaks to everything you mentioned, Alice, about his generosity and time. And it's quite fascinating that Hughes was able to do that at that time and promote these particular things. And it's always struck me as kind of surprising that this is a fact that just is stunning. Langston Hughes is the only figure from the Harlem Renaissance to actually set foot in Africa.
Oh, wow.
When you think of everything of Marcus, I'm being generous here, but you think of James Baldwin, right? You think of other people. They do not have the African connection. Langston Hughes traveled there personally in 1923, and he went to the coast, and he was shocked that they did not regard him as Black. He was shunned from personal events that took place in a Nigerian dance because they said, you're a white person. You obviously have white blood in your skin. You're too light-skinned for us. You don't count as Black over here. And so he had to completely see race differently because of his physical engagements with Africa. And as the state is not the state, it's just mind-boggling. Even when King can't mention him in speeches, people are sending him overseas to represent America from the State Department, because the government and the FBI are two completely different worlds when it comes to the State Department and the FBI. And so he's inviting Nina Simone to perform over in Nigeria. He's going along with Lionel Hampton and performing jazz festivals in Nigeria. And he has probably the most important moment of his life when he goes to perform in late 1960s at this incredible festival overseas. And when he is really presented in that particular fashion, it's quite staggering what reputation he has in Senegal. And the reputation was this: reporters said that in 1966, Langston Hughes was followed in Africa the way baseball players are hounded for autographs in America. Just crowds of people who just want to get close to him, let alone talk to him. So yeah, that generosity, I think, is part of his personality, and also an understanding of how difficult things actually were.
And can you also talk about the John Brown raid, and how his grandmother's first husband, Lewis Leary, was one of the 5 African Americans killed of the 22.
Yes, and this kind of goes back to Jorge's question about why you feel a kind of certain burden of things. Langston Hughes was raised that if you're a member of the Langston family, you do important things in this world. And remember, if you ever meet anyone named Langston, they're named after Langston Hughes, because up to him, Langston is only a last name. He was born James Hughes, didn't want his father's first name. And so we get this kind of switch to Langston in this particular way. And so he's the first person ever first named Langston in the world. But Langston Hughes went to bed under the tutelage of his grandmother with a blanket, he believed, Lewis Leary carried into battle, dying while he fought with John Brown at Harper's Ferry. So 9 years old, go to sleep. Hey, here's this comforter. Remember what your uncle did. He put his life on the line to end and abolish slavery. Now, it was kind of fascinating. I went out of the world of literature into history, and there's actually been scientific studies on that shawl, that blanket, and we now know that it was actually a ceremonial blanket that was given and delivered, not one that he actually wore. It was commemorative. That's the kind of level of this Langston Hughes draws, to kind of looking at his body of things. But nonetheless, that was the burden. Langston Hughes' lineage included one of the first senators of Black descent from the state of Virginia. And of course, his mom had to grow up in a town where the local university, Langston University, was named after a relative of hers in Guthrie, Oklahoma. So Langston Hughes was born into the burden. And he didn't feel like he had a choice. It was, what would your contribution be, in what regard? And of course, he eventually found that to be a contribution of letters, as you said so well. And it is remarkable that he would carry around that kind of a legacy. Again, at about, in his early years, he saw his grandmother, Mary Langston, on the platform with President Roosevelt, recognizing the contributions of her then husband, Louis Leary. So he was in high company from the very start. And it's always kind of strange because he lives his life in poverty, and that never really ends. And yet that poverty is also in line all the time with prestige and reputation, because his family has this simultaneous reputation, heritage, and prestige, and yet it doesn't translate into things financially in this regard. And Louis Leary is a really interesting character for that.
Thank you. And I also, if you could talk a little bit about Langston Hughes's health. You mentioned his teeth, and he died of prostate cancer, well, complications, because, and I'm wondering, did he ignore his symptoms, or, it just seems really sudden how he died in the hospital.
It really is a sad ending to things. He was completely productive up to the last month of his life. In fact, his final books of poems comes out after his death, posthumously, but he had done all the editorial work for it, and so we don't see this decline. We see him at this time go into the hospital for what he thinks is something very, very serious that he has neglected. He neglected for at least two reasons. One, he didn't have health care. Number two, he had had health problems in the past and hadn't got very good service. He checked in under his father's name, James Hughes, and so the people that worked on him did not even know they had the famous writer in their midst when they started their diagnosis. And they believed, as you said, that he had prostate cancer, and decided to go in for the surgery with a very incompetent surgeon, again, not knowing who they were dealing with. They did not find actual cancer of the prostate. What they found is a badly neglected infection, so bad that it had spread severely. And Langston Hughes then sat up on what he recognized was going to be his deathbed, put together several materials, including writing a handwritten letter to Dr. King, which has never been found after my 11 years of searching. And we don't know what happened to that letter. We know it was delivered. We have confirmation of it. Dr. King never wrote back because Langston Hughes died before he could. But what happened was Langston Hughes then passes away from an infection for a surgery that never really had to happen. That had a lot to do with his privacy. I don't want anybody to know I'm here. Again, that kind of concealing feature. It had a lot to do with health coverage and care, and it had a lot to do with his own neglect for his health, ignoring really serious problems. You'd think there would be any number of other things that would have come up to him, not that. That's how it was. And so, again, to contextualize, the day after his death, nobody even knew Langston Hughes was sick or in the hospital, except for very close friends, 3 or 4. And the headline, not on the front page, the headline in the New York Times was Langston Hughes dies. That's the kind of reputation he had at that time. And it was the bold headline, not one amongst many. It was the top line category that he had died.
And his, thank you, Jason. And his teeth were messed up. Was that because of smoking or bad diet?
It's so interesting because you will have kind of this neglect of health and again, kind of traveling and growing up in certain kind of ways. And yeah, his teeth had gone badly in the 50s and kind of deteriorated in that way. And he'd had a bridge put in. This again had a lot to do with finances and money to have this kind of care. First of all, was kind of just beyond his thought process for how you took care of a body. And then second was just cost involved and any number of things in that regard. But yeah, those things kind of held it. And then the most challenging part was he became very overweight at the end of his life. And so he was actually invited to march with Dr. King at Selma. That March 15th, 1965 window is right when it became safe for Dr. King to start referencing Langston Hughes again. And so he sent him a telegram inviting him to come march to Selma. This is the third safe march, not the one that John Lewis faced. And Hughes had to decline for any number of reasons. One of them was that he was simply overweight to a state where he had difficulty walking long distances. And there's one funny thing I had to parse out in this new research. Nina Simone talks about traveling with Langston Hughes to perform at a concert in Selma. And my eyes lit up because I'd been researching this for years. And finally, I had to make a call to Nina Simone's biographer. And she told me, she said, Nina Simone just lied so much throughout her autobiography, you can't trust anything. So I was relieved because I thought I'd missed something, that the two had traveled together, but they had not. And so Hughes's health plays a lot of important roles in that regard.
Cool, thank you. Any other questions while we have Jason on the stage?
I had one thing I wanted to bring up.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike, please.
Yeah. When you're talking about Adam Clayton Powell, I have been a big fan of Fats Waller for years. And Fats Waller grew up knowing Adam Clayton Powell Jr. And Adam Clayton Powell's father was a pastor at the Abyssinian Baptist Church. And Waller loved to play the organ. He not only played piano, but he loved Bach and all. And sometimes Adam Clayton Powell Jr. would sneak Waller into the church in order to play the huge organ that they had in there. So there's some more connection with Langston Hughes in blues, in jazz and things like that. So I wanted to share that.
That is terrific, these connections. It's amazing how many things kind of overlap in this particular realm in this world. One of the more fascinating things when you talk about generations and interconnectedness was I tracked down that Langston Hughes had become part of this theater connection in New York City, the Harlem Suitcase Theater. So he founded 5 different theaters across America. The Harlem Suitcase Theater was founded because you could have everything that you needed for a performance in a suitcase. You didn't need props or staging or background. And I realized that Langston Hughes had this poem read out loud throughout the 1930s, particularly in 1937. And I was wondering, how good was this guy that read this poem on stage? Who was this guy? What was his voice? And I started looking back and kind of tracking things down, and finally got to a point. I said, let's see, the guy's Earl Jones. And I realized that the person that had read this poem on stage in 1937 was the son of James Earl Jones, the voice of Darth Vader and the one that tells us this is CNN. So you do get these lines of people with these unbelievable heritages, juniors and seniors, and that's unbelievable to think about. Fats Waller in a church service. This was very much Langston Hughes' dedication in the late 60s. Just as he had brought blues to poetry, he was the first to bring gospel music to the stage. And one of my last presentations before COVID hit was over at the North Carolina Museum of Art, which had done a performance of Black Nativity, and they'd asked me to set the context for that. And it was quite staggering because Hughes was sneaking into churches throughout Harlem, listening to what songs were going on and what was being played. And he found everything you mentioned, Mike, common contemporary guitars, organs, music, secular music. And so he brought that into the play that he wrote, Black Nativity, and started bringing gospel to the stages. And that play started touring the world in that particular regard. And it is fascinating, these connections of things that happen in terms of all these things. And you even have figures like the great Aretha Franklin, whose father, R.W. Franklin, was the one that introduced Dr. King when he spoke in Detroit on June 23rd, 1963, in front of 10,000 people at Cobo Hall. So you get reverends raising these unbelievable musicians. The Fats Waller connection is a wonderful one. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Mike. And let's see. Anybody else have any other questions for Jason? Because it's time to do our group picture. Okay, if y'all can put your screen on, look like Denise, if you could put your screen on. And I'll take this opportunity for folks who are watching the recording. Thank you all for watching Wonderland Book Club's Dr. Jason Miller's presentation on the incredibly diverse and magnificent life of Langston Hughes. So, round of applause. This discussion went too fast. So, see y'all next time for Wonderland Book Club, which is November 13th. And take care.